And then lastly, just briefly touch on another terminology item on the timeline, which is Freedom Summer. And Freedom Summer is essentially it was a movement within a bigger movement. Um, it was to increase black voter registration, specifically in Mississippi. And it was basically part of a project of some student organizations and activist organizations, um, the Congress of Racial Inequality, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and overall the goal was to increase black voters in the South. And of course, Mississippi was the worst as far as that ability. Even though African Americans had gotten the right to vote federally, a lot of these places were trying to use local measures to combat that federal right. And it took, as many as you may know, it took different forms, uh, suppressed through violence, tactics, and some more like covert tactics, which were like the literacy and aptitude tests. People have to take poll taxes, a bunch of different stuff to try to prevent registration for a number of reasons. Of course, in the South, even though we're talking about post Great Migration, there's always been a very strong presence in the South. It's not like slavery ended and then black people just all went to the North or West or wherever. That the South is still very, very black in a lot of ways. And of course, in this time, we're still seeing a shift from rural to metropolitan. So some of the more like um, Montgomery, Alabama, and some of these other places where we saw a little bit more success with some of these voter movements. Definitely in the rural areas is where there were even more challenges. Um, so, yeah, the 1964 Freedom Summer, it was a more coordinated and widespread effort, to address this larger problem. And, I think the idea by focusing on Mississippi um, was not only was it probably the most challenging and worst spot to try to do it in, but just focusing not on the entire South, but focusing on a single point, you could essentially overwhelm or overflow these kind of target areas. And in this case, it was with predominantly white college students, to the point where the responses and tactics they're using were not going to be effective just because you're having this mass, idealistically or ideally thousands of people just kind of trying to get all of these voters registered at once. Hopefully, it just becomes a point where they're overwhelmed. They can't utilize these tactics. It just becomes too much. And at the same time, you won't get these violent attacks and all of that just because, it's been made clear that this is a unified movement. That was the idea, at least. And in addition to that voter registration goal, there are also educational goals. There are the freedom schools, and there's an agenda, a political agenda to try to, kind of change the face of some of the delegates in Congress and that's the Assembly. Um, and so all this kind of came together to, you know, like I said, it was mostly college students, predominantly white college students. They faced a lot of opposition, both violence, arrests, arson, beatings, all of that sort of resistance that you can imagine or have seen before on a, when looking at the history. And one of the things, though, is that, this opposition was to these white, very often affluent, because you think about, it's Freedom Summer, so we have like a lot of these college students, and when you don't just think about it face value or race value, as far as these are white affluent students. In those cases, you're going to have connections. Most likely, your family will be connected. So, for these students, a lot of these students are connected to higher power areas, places, businesses, political connections, whatnot. And because to do this, obviously, it's summer. You're in college, and if you don't need to work, I know college was different at the time, but if you're not needing to work, or you need to have basically some sort of supply, some money flow to pay for gas and to essentially survive without some sort of income of your own. And of course, for this movement, the volunteers were supposed to, in many cases, get Mississippi driver's license and license plates. So it was a whole process, and so you kind of had to relocate for the summer. So of course, in a lot of cases, these were going to be more affluent individuals who were able to participate in this. And because of that, the opposition they faced, it got a lot of attention, a lot of national media attention, as well as government attention, because all of a sudden, you're messing with people who had that sort of additional power or links to power to see that as a little bit more problematic. And also, of course, the media is going to follow this type of story because it's attractive, it's interesting. And so, even though the goal, they successfully connected with the community, the schools and everything. Politically, I think a lot of those connections were made. But as far as actual registration, to actually register and have those votes count, it basically failed. They registered or attempted to register quite a few thousands of people, but very few of them were actually recognized and counted. But with that media and that public attention aspect, that was a huge component of the I think it was 1965 civil rights voting bill that was passed. And of course, a lot of the other, like the schools and some of the other social, some of the other social goals, and just having the college students have that experience, it was huge for some of the later civil rights and social rights activist goals. And the reason it was on this timeline, of course, was in addition to that, a lot of these students were able, for the first time, to really get exposed to some of these rural blues artists and the music that was really still, integrated in the culture into some of these rural areas. So some of the older R&B and blues style artists, as well as just being into some of these like juke joints, some of these clubs that are in Mississippi and other places in the South that have a really different feel than you would get in some of the more northern urban cities like Chicago or Memphis, New York. It's definitely a different feel, and you get a little bit more. Even to this day, if you go down there, you'll get some Delta blues artists that you just don't really see unless you really look for them other places. So it was a big exposure, and it kind of helped a revival to a certain extent of some of these other styles of blues or artists that may have already been well known and got a little bit of a revival themselves as well.